a few thoughts. We would normally work through class discussion concerning the synchronous exercise that we began on Thursday, the one with the animals with the three slides, the three PowerPoint slides. And this exercise, which you will be continuing on with on our next synchronous session this coming Thursday. So the main takeaway of this exercise is that there is more to a compare and contrast essay than merely listing similarities and differences between two items, two texts, two events, two historical figures, or in the case of this exercise, two animals, right? If I just showed you a slide of a duck and a platypus and said, list the similarities and differences between these two animals, there wouldn't be a whole lot of point to that. I mean, it would be it would just be an exercise in description, really, right? And where does that get us? The key thing to take away from this exercise is that there are really three elements in writing a compare and contrast argumentative essay. For our purposes, so element one, element two, the two texts, the two articles, the two essays that you're working with. And the third element is the conversation in which both of these texts are taking part, right? So it doesn't have to be text per se. We could be talking about two historical figures that are somehow connected through circumstance, and that is the conversation in which they are participating in, using the term conversation kind of loosely. You know, it could be two scientific theories, two musical artists, it could be two actors, it could be two presidents, it could be the Black Lives Matter movement and the civil rights movement of the 60s, right? So we're using the term text loosely. Text could represent a lot of different things: historical situations, historical movements, historical figures, pop culture figures, intellectual figures, academic figures. But in its most direct sense, which is how we will be dealing with it for the rest of the semester, with the word text, is in terms of a written piece, a written article, a written essay. You know, it could be a novel, a story, or something like that. But we're not going to be writing about novels and stories exactly, for the most part. With some blurred lines, like A Modest Proposal could kind of be considered an act of fiction. But let's not get lost in that right now, right? So the key thing is that there are three elements in a compare and contrast essay, in our compare and contrast essay: two texts and the conversation in which those texts are taking place. So with this exercise that you started on Thursday, the most meaningful way to approach it is to consider the animals as being analogous to the texts. The animals represent written texts. They are concrete, complete vehicles of meaning. So for the third element, the animals are the texts, elements 1 and 2. So for the third element, on the first two slides, you have the obstacle course and the house, right? Those represent the conversations. And what's important to note about them, with the slide with the duck and the platypus, and which creature would win that obstacle course? The important thing in formulating your answer for that slide, for that question, it was, of course, the features of the animals, right? But it was also the features of that specific obstacle course. You're not talking about all of the obstacle courses that ever existed. In formulating your answer, you have to consider the features of that specific obstacle course. The house and the flying squirrel and the koala bear, and trying to figure out, or trying to come up with an answer to decide which one of those animals you would hire to build that house for you. As important as the features, as the qualities of those animals are the specific features of that house, right? You're not talking about all of the houses that ever existed. It's not a question of whether you would hire if you were going to be living in a bungalow, that's the house you commissioned. On the one hand, or on the other hand, a 120 home mansion with 5 baths, 3 bedrooms, and so on and so forth. Your answer might change because it's a different conversation, right? Same category, categorically, it's a similar conversation. They're both houses, right? But the specifics of the house are incredibly different. So, say, for example, the car and Turkle articles, right? If we were going to make an analogy between those, would be our animals, right? The car, the Nicholas car, is Google making us stupid? That would be one of our animals, one of our texts in this situation, right? The Sherry Turkle article, stop Googling, let's talk, that would be our other one. So we have our 2 texts in this exercise represented by the 2 animals. So the conversation, it's not just technology, right? If we're making the analogy, the comparison to the exercise, technology would be all obstacle courses, or in the case of the koala bear and the flying squirrel, all houses, right? But the thing is, with those 2 articles, say, if you were going to be writing a compare and contrast essay about car and Turkle, which many of you, for your argumentative essay, essentially did write a compare and contrast essay, and if that was what you did, I made comments on your paper accordingly, right? You have to narrow it down. You're not talking about all technology. In that case, you'd mostly be talking about a specific kind of technology, specifically the internet. The internet is your obstacle course, and for some of you, it's even finer, right? Social media. Then, in coming up with an evaluative response, social media, the possibilities of research on the internet research, digital archives, and let's say streaming services, right? So these things are all encompassed by the internet: social media, digital archives, and streaming services. If we were going to continue on with this analogy to an obstacle course, right? Those would be 3 obstacles. Those would be the specifics that you're considering. If we want to find the analogy in the house, those would be the rooms. Those would be the different floors of the house. The specific, the particular specifications of that house, right? You're not talking about all the houses. You're not talking about all technology. You're talking about the internet, and then, but not even just the internet. So to continue on with the house analogy, it's not just all bungalows, or it's not just all mansions. You have to get even finer. It's that particular, on that slide that you started with the exercise, it's that particular house, right? Those particular dimensions, floors, whatever. With the obstacle course, it's that particular obstacle course with the balance beam and the tire swings, whatever was on there, right? Different obstacle courses might have different obstacles, different kinds of technology. If you wanted to talk about different kinds of technology in relation to car and Turkle, they're pretty overt in what they're talking about, but you could still try to do it. You talk about like video games, say, right, in relation to car and Turkle. Pretty different than social media, and they don't really spend a lot of time, if any time at all, talking about video games, but you could probably discuss them in relation to video games, which would be a very different obstacle course, right? A very different conversation than talking about social media. So you have to find the conversation to which the 2 texts that you're comparing and contrasting plug in. Now, what should be the main takeaway from the 3rd slide? When there is not there's no particular purpose, there's no particular point of connection between the octopus and the tarantula on that third slide, right? You had to come up with something. So sometimes you can write a compare and contrast essay in which the conversation itself develops out of that comparison and contrasting of the two texts. So, for example, of the texts we've read so far, you can maybe talk about, like, consider the lobster in A Modest Proposal. There's nothing really overtly that connects those texts. Not like Carr and Turkle, where both of them, even to the point of having Google in the title of both of their pieces, right? They talk overtly about the internet. They talk directly about social media connections and so on and so forth. There's no direct connection between David Foster Wallace's Consider the Lobster and Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, right? You could, by placing those two texts together, considering not only what they have in common or what is different with them, you can develop a conversation out of those two texts. And that is essentially the main takeaway of the third slide. There's not a conversation presented that directly encompasses the two creatures. But by placing them into juxtaposition with one another, you create the conversation out of them. Right? So you're creating the conversation out of the text as represented by the animal. And whenever you're working on something like that, if you were going to write a compare and contrast argumentative essay about Jonathan Swift's The Modest Proposal, David Foster Wallace's Consider the Lobster, you want to start with what they have in common. That's your starting point. So you pick out those little pieces that those two texts have in common. You might have to search a little bit. Or perhaps there was something when you were reading them that stuck out to you. Something about the way they form their argument, maybe. Or a certain kind of humor that they use. Or a certain kind of directness, a certain indirect method of persuasion that they use. Maybe something clicked while you were reading these, and there was a recall when you were reading A Modest Proposal where you thought back to Consider the Lobster and thought, well, the subjects are entirely different, but there's something about the way that they are approaching their subjects that is similar. That's your starting point. That's where the conversation begins to form. You're not always trying to place things in competition with one another, right? Not all compare and contrast essays are which one of the text is making a more valid point. Even with Carr and Turkle, right? If you were going to be placing them into the conversation of technology, of social media, and of the internet, you're not necessarily placing them into competition with one another. Oftentimes, you're exploring how two texts jointly create a more complete perspective. You're exploring how two different texts might create a more complex, nuanced, combined argument that speaks to the central point of the conversation at hand. Right. So many times, the most effective compare and contrast essays seek out the differences and the similarities and expose the common threads within the differences. So that's what I want you to think about as we come down this stretch of the semester. Is one of the big things. How can we find subtle differences in what seem to be obvious similarities, right? And it's tricky. It's not necessarily easy, but that's where you find the meaning. And it is around those points that you should strive to construct your thesis, because this is where new ideas begin to emerge. And you're not simply expounding on the idea, you're not simply summarizing the two different arguments or whatever presented by the two different texts. You're trying to develop a new idea from within the space between those two texts, trying to add something to the conversation. So you're taking what both of these two parties contributed to the conversation, or you're forming a conversation out of those two texts and taking it a step farther. You're creating a conversation and taking it a step farther. You're joining into a conversation and adding something to it that none of the two texts that brought you into that conversation have really said, have really yet contributed. All right, so we'll be working on this as we go for the rest of the semester, for the coming weeks, and it will be fun and interesting to see what you all come up with. Good night.